This is House Planning Help, episode 39. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and if you want to build or retrofit a property, then this is the podcast for you. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Today, Mark Elton from Sustainable by Design, he is my guest as we delve into phased retrofits. So Happy New Year! Here we are again, this time the first podcast of 2014. And as you might be able to tell, I've got a cold. It's always great at Christmas, you spend time with the family, probably relax. I took myself off social media, said no, I'm not going near that at all. And I don't know what's happened, whether it's just there's always someone in the family with a cold, or that my guard was down and I was enjoying too much good food and a little bit of alcohol, and yes, it's happened. But anyway, hopefully I can shift this soon, and we've got a good interview for you today. You're really going to like this one. But just before I move off Christmas, it was an opportunity to observe the rest of the family and their energy efficiency habits, which are good on the whole, but a few candidates of my family who I won't name and shame, just the lights were constantly left on. And this always strikes a chord in me when I see a light on and no one in the room. And I suppose we've had this a few times. We know that there are lots of technological solutions creating low energy homes, but it is down to behaviour change too. And I always find that's the toughest one and also Christmas shopping, when you see doors of different stores wide open and all that heat just going out of the door. That kills me, that one. Anyway, let's get into this session's interview. The topic is phased retrofits, and Tim Shepherd and John Mason got two separate questions from you guys. Well, actually quite long emails, but I wanted to thank you, and you've triggered off this episode. So Mark Elton from Sustainable by Design is going to help answer them. A quick aside here, when I was listening back to this interview, there's a moment when I start talking about pasties, and I thought, without context, this is just incredibly random and you're not going to have a clue what's going on here. So I'll try and explain a little bit. Mark is from the West Country, and this part of the world where he's from, Cornish pasties are all the rage. They're the equivalent of smoked salmon, oysters, Cornish okay, yeah, well, they're a delicacy in that part of the world if you ever get a chance to taste one of them for our international audience. But I mention this because he tweets about this quite often, and it seems to have been an in-joke on Twitter amongst the Passive House community. So there, I've set the scene. Hopefully when you hear that bit, it's not going to be quite so random now. But I started by asking Mark about his background in retrofitting.
So I joined ECD Architects before I worked here at Sustainable Design, who had a ongoing track record in high-rise refurbishment, tower blocks, that sort of thing. And as it became more, it kind of rose up the agenda of the sustainable architectural world, I got opportunities to work on some projects that were pushing the boundaries at the time. Found it was quite challenging, but quite rewarding, and with so many older buildings in the UK, it's an area that we as architects can't afford to ignore, really. So that's why it was important to me to take up that.
We've talked about retrofits a little bit, but not too much on phased retrofits. And I must admit, I've struggled to find information on this. So I did a bit of asking around and your name came up, which is why I'm sitting right here. So can we start with what a phased retrofit is?
Well, when we talk about retrofit of buildings, we tend to talk about whole house retrofit as being the ultimate aim. So that's a comprehensive package of measures which will include thermal insulation, window enhancements, more efficient heating systems, and some form of dealing with ventilation and air leakage as part of a whole package. So a phased retrofit would be one where perhaps you can't afford to do the entire property in one hit, and you focus on those areas that you can address initially until other funding comes along or different opportunities come later in your occupancy of that building.
I know that one of the aspects of retrofit is it's very disruptive. So does that mean that going down a phased retrofit route, you're almost repeating the disruption, or does that not actually end up being the case?
Some things are more disruptive than others, but yeah, you're prolonging the disruption, and you're delaying the benefits that you will ultimately get from the retrofit, because it's not until you've closed that loop and got a complete package of measures that you're really making the retrofit process work for you.
What is the first step? Is it about setting an energy target?
I think it's having a strategy. It doesn't necessarily have to be a target at that point, but it's looking at an individual property and understanding what its constraints are, what its opportunities are, where are the trigger points. When perhaps you look at that property and it needs re-roofing, that's the first time you get in there and you focus on that bit. Or perhaps you're building an extension in 5 years' time and you think, well, that's my opportunity to do that bit. So it's looking for those trigger points and those opportunities, I think.
Now, we've had a couple of emails that have some quite specific questions. So I don't know, I might read it through if you want to stop me at any point or answer at the end. So we'll start with Tim Shepherd's, which says, which parts of a renovation towards the Passive House standard create the most savings, and additionally, which are the most cost effective? For example, which is more efficient and reduces energy requirements, an insulated slab, insulated outer wall, windows, doors, or roofing insulation? I realise it can't be done piecemeal, but I am trying to get my head around which is the most useful renovation to conserve energy. Some sort of breakdown of the different elements would be great.
I can't give you exact figures on the individual percentages, but clearly heat tends to rise. So roof insulation is very important. That's where you can make big inroads. But floor insulation, it depends on the type of floor. If you've got a solid floor, your heat loss may be less in that area because you haven't got cold air coming up through those floorboards. But floors and roofs tend to be smaller areas, and then your walls, if it's a detached building, you've got a lot of area. If it's a terrace building, you haven't got so much of your external walls, so that becomes less important. It's difficult to say that generically, but roofs tend to be the easier bit to do. If it's loft insulation, for example, focus on that. That can be straightforward at starting point.
Is there a logical sequence? We've identified the loft, but would it go loft, walls, slab, or does it just change on every project?
Well, as I say, ideally you're doing all these things together, but the logical sequence really depends on your particular circumstances. But if those circumstances were flexible, I would probably suggest that starting at the top is a good way to do it. If you make your roof interventions the priority, you can be maximising the level of insulation standards up there without affecting other aspects of your building. You can even, if you're renewing a roof, you could begin to think ahead, planning ahead. How can I extend my eaves on verges now so that when I come to do external wall insulation later, I'm ready for that. So there are things you could be doing all along to enhance what comes later. And I think the most important watchword is don't carry something out that's going to prevent you from continuing your strategy later on. Maybe
I should ask about who does this then, because if it's a phase retrofit, are you ideally really wanting one person to oversee all the different phases, even if they are years apart?
I don't think it has to be. You might buy a property and look to do a loft extension. Clearly that's do the loft extension, adds value to the property, gives you an insulated lid to that whole building. Plan it so that you can come along later to do external wall insulation. That might be 5 years later, and it might be just an external wall specialist that does that. If you're looking at doing the external walls, you might consider doing the windows at the same time, because the way that the windows interact with that insulation can be quite important. So maybe that's a window fitter and an external wall insulation expert. When you're looking at floors, say if you've got a timber suspended floor, it could be that you can do that yourself. You can take up those floorboards, you can lay in a support membrane, you can put a mineral wall insulation in between those floor joists and put that all back down, and that doesn't require a specialist at all. So I think, if you're breaking up into phases, look at each phase and see who's the right person to be doing that.
Do you notice the difference? I know it has to be cohesive at the end of all of this, but let's say you did 2 walls of a house and it had 4 walls. Would you notice anything after that first phase?
I think you would. Some rooms are going to be affected more than the others. So If you've got a north-facing room and you insulate the north-facing wall, then I would think you would see some improvement in that particular room. Not least because your external wall, the inside surface of your external wall is now not cold, it's a warm surface, so you don't get that radiative coolth effect that you'll get from a cold wall surface. If you replace windows, a lot of older Victorian properties, it could be that the street frontage is a much higher percentage of glazing, single glazing, perhaps quite drafty, and actually replacing the windows may have the biggest impact in those rooms, and then you definitely will see the benefit from reduced drafts and from greatly enhanced U-value performance from a single glazed starting point.
I hear conflicting advice on this about sometimes keeping those original windows is a good idea. Do you have to choose between going down a conservation route or going for triple glazed windows, whatever it might be that you're choosing? Do you have to make that decision?
Conservation officers have an influence here because it kind of depends on the level of heritage value of your property. I've worked on retrofits where we were looking to use vacuum glazing, so that's like very, very thin double glazing really with a 0.5 millimetre gap between it, which is evacuated. But it changes the appearance of a sash type window because glazing bars have to be stuck on. Now from a distance you're not going to notice that, but up close an expert will be able to tell the difference. And in this case the conservation officer rejected our ideas for that, and in another case you might be able to get away with slimline double glazing as a replacement just for the glass, keep the original glazing bars in. But if it's that sensitive, you may have to look to secondary glazing, so that's an internal secondary layer of double glazing that covers the opening but means that the original windows are unaffected. It's a tricky balance, and you'll find a lot of conservation architects will say that those original windows are sacrosanct, and you'll find others who perhaps come from a more energy-saving background who will absolutely say, look, there are bigger fish, sort of bigger problems to deal with here. We can't get hung up about 6 millimetre Georgian glazing bars.
Let's move on to this second email then that says, "Hi Ben, really enjoying the podcast. I'm contemplating an energy efficient refurbishment and house extension. What should be done first? Is there a logical order of priority? Biggest gains first, most disruptive first? Advice on how the transition from needing a heating system to potentially not needing one can be made. Do I extend first or refurb first?" Lots of questions there, I know, but ultimately this is a topic area that must have a wider relevance in terms of the majority of housing stock and everyone in the population. And that's from John Mason.
We touched on this a bit. I think if you're looking to do a rooftop extension, deal with the roof first. I think that's a sensible strategy. Also, if you're looking at ultimately extending a property, you should prioritise that first because you can make the external walls of that extension to the highest possible new build standard. And if you were to do it in reverse and install a new heating system that wasn't then sized to accommodate your new extended property, potentially there's a mismatch there. So,
I think you've lost me just there. And say that again.
Well, if you let's say you're building quite a large ground floor extension, I don't know in this particular instance how big we're talking about, but it may be looking to replace a boiler in the early stages in a property that's largely uninsulated and quite small, but the ultimate end game in his strategy is a much larger property that's much better insulated. Really, that's when your heating system needs to be matched to those longer term circumstances.
Are you saying then that if you have this extension and it's well insulated, that you wouldn't really need any extra heating because it would be okay, so that when you came to replace the heating system, that could be further down the line, I think?
Yeah, it's a complicated scenario because, how old is the boiler? It might be that it's beneficial for you to replace it earlier because A, it's going to break down, B, it's highly inefficient now. You've got to look at each measure in individual. But I think the important thing we touched on right at the beginning was to have this end game strategy. Where am I aiming to be with this? What can I do first and foremost that isn't going to affect things further down the line? Ultimately, for a retrofit, you're looking to create a continual thermal envelope around the building, and that includes the floor and the roof and the walls and the windows. And you're looking to improve the airtightness of that property to get rid of drafts. But you can't do that without thinking about your ventilation strategy. And if you were going for Enefit or Passive House, the level of airtightness that you've got there, really you wouldn't expect to live in that environment without having introduced your heat recovery ventilation system along the way. So there's certain measures, there's a symbiosis between them, Don't put in heat recovery ventilation until you've dealt with the airtightness, because you don't get the efficiency gains, but vice versa. Don't have a super airtight building that doesn't have a heat recovery ventilation system or some form of mechanical extract ventilation and make-up air.
You're also wanting to allow for where all the ducting will go, and this, you might lose a little bit of space, but he's just said that he's going to extend as well, so that's a good opportunity to get that space back.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of where we've been involved in heat recovery ventilation in retrofit scenarios, most of that ductwork is going at high level. If you plan it correctly, you can keep those duct runs fairly short in the corners of rooms. You're just boxing out at high level. Typically, you're going to try and do that in the hallway or above cupboards, above toilets, so that its impact on your main rooms is minimal. And then you just need to identify suitable space for the heat recovery unit itself, and like I say, that might be in a new build area, and it really needs to be on an outside wall in an insulated cupboard of some kind. So yeah, planning that ahead is a good strategy.
Are you perhaps thinking about remodelling as well at the same time, because this would be your opportunity to do it? So if there was a wall that needed to come out, that would be the time.
Absolutely. I think retrofit and a chance to redesign your home go hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive, and quite often one triggers the other. I've been doing a lot of work with the RIBA to develop the idea of retrofit coordinators, so that architects will get involved in retrofit from start to finish, so they would be responsible for the initial interface with a potential client, help deal with funding, help deal with finding a contractor, help deal with a handover at the end. And one of the reasons why we want architects to take up this is because they can walk into a property to be retrofit and perhaps see other design opportunities, knocking a wall down here, rethinking this, putting in a new window there, that might be beyond the scope of the pure energy bit, but add value to the property at the same time. And if you can add a lot of value to your property, that almost funds the retrofit measures in the first place. So the two must go hand in hand, I think.
I did a blog post with Marion Bailey, and one of the issues that she brought up was certain retrofits, if the property price is too low and it's unlikely to go up to a certain level if you're in a certain area. What do you think in that situation? What can you do if it's not going to add enough to the value? Are you doing it for your own comfort, just from that peace of mind of saving the energy?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons for doing it. Now's a great time to try to get your head around that, because of the rises to fuel costs being very high up the agenda at the moment. So it's very much in people's minds. So it depends how long I guess you're going to live in the property. If you're planning to spend a considerable number of years in that property, why wouldn't you want to do what you can to improve your internal environment, to make it more comfortable, because you're going to be the one to benefit from that. If you're doing up a property in order to, as a development project, maybe you've got different priorities in one area. I'd like to think in the future that changes anyway, and estate agents start to value properties that have had energy efficiency improvements. So maybe in time we'll get to a point where it is much more cost effective from a value point of view anyway.
Why do you think that hasn't happened? Because I agree with you 100%. It will get to the point that if you're saving a silly amount of money, then it'll be worth more.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's only now that fuel costs are getting so high enough that people are really having to think hard about this, and that's unfortunate that we're in that scenario. I just don't think it's high enough up our national agenda, and estate agents don't really get it. They don't really put forward your EPCs. They don't understand that. They don't promote it enough, and the general public don't understand the value of that enough. And I think architects as a profession with the construction industry generally have got to get that message across, because it's going to happen. We've got really tough carbon targets to meet in this country. Nearly 40 to 50% of those emissions currently come from our buildings. So we're going to have to do some serious retrofit on a lot of buildings in order to get anywhere close to those targets. So we've got to bring the public along with us.
Some buildings have a form factor that's easier to retrofit. So if we're going out and we're moving house anyway, relocating somewhere, is there anything or any other factors that we should be considering?
Well, I think people will still choose location as their main priority. But I do find myself, I look at properties, I think, I could retrofit that fairly easily. That would be straightforward to retrofit. And
Why?
I would tend to look towards properties that you can externally insulate. It's an easier, less disruptive process. It retains some of the thermal mass of that building on the inside. There are less tricky issues to do with interstitial condensation to deal with. So if you're looking at a property to retrofit with external wall insulation, clearly you're looking for not too many obstructions on the outside, perhaps an overhanging eaves that has plenty of scope for that to work with, windows that are suboptimal and you're going to have to replace anyway, so I can do that at the same time as my external wall insulation. Perhaps one with not too many single-storey extensions and too many bits and pieces stuck all over the side. You're looking at something that's, if you want it to be cheap and cost-effective, something that's fairly rational and something that the planning officer is not going to object to you putting an insulated render solution on the outside. Maybe it's already a white rendered building. Those are the ones that you look at and sometimes think, well, that'd be a real snip to retrofit.
And I imagine that there are certain properties in a good area that might be built in the 60s, and now you can look at them in a different light, thinking, as you say, the outside is going to change completely, but what am I really interested in? The location is just right.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And we're a lot of work that I do and we do here at Sustainable by Design is looking at post-war housing stock, because generally, the sizes of the properties are quite good. The locations of the properties are quite good. Usually it's the communal environments or the general external environment that's poor, and the heating standards of those properties. They're typically solid concrete walls, or maybe they've got an inch of expanded polystyrene in them, and people can't afford to heat them to a comfortable temperature. But they're the ones where a retrofit scheme actually enhances the architectural appearance and really does transform those blocks, because all of a sudden, the people that enjoyed their interiors from a spatial point of view can now enjoy them from a thermal comfort point of view as well. And it enhances the area generally.
Thinking about another approach here that, again, I haven't seen too often, but I'm wondering, for a large property that perhaps is a period property where there might be issues of expense, could you have almost a side of the house that you live in, or a bolt hole that would be passive house, or just give you that comfy environment that you could just use for those short months in the winter, and then just live in your house as you have been when it gets to the summer?
Yeah, I guess that would work in theory. I don't know about a full passive house, because obviously you've got air tightness issues of, as we get smaller, it's much harder to make smaller buildings to full passive house.
Oh, right. Why? Can you explain that?
Well, because of the form factor of those particular, as buildings get smaller, there's a lot more surface area than floor area. So it's much harder. If you think of, I always describe it like this, I always talk about, people understand babies get cold because they've got a small body mass for a big surface area. And as we get bigger, like ourselves, the reverse is true. So I don't lose as much heat as a baby does. So
a pasty or two.
Yeah, that's a pasty. Can't pasty a day. So, passive houses are similar, really. It's like the smaller a property is, the harder it is to achieve a higher energy efficiency standard. But having said that, if you pick the back of a property north facing, you super insulate that, you improve the glazing there, then there's no doubt it's going to be more comfortable than it was previously. So doing it phase by phase, yes, you will start to see some benefits, but you won't see the full benefit until the whole package of measures comes together at the completion of a retrofit.
Looking at phased retrofits as we get towards the end of the interview now, are they really practical. Would it just be better to wait until we can afford to do it in one hit?
Look, I think there's no doubt that retrofitting at scale is a lot more cost effective. In an ideal world, you would get all of your neighbours in a street, start a kind of mini transition organisation for your street, all get together, all agree what your retrofit schemes would be, have a single planning application for the whole street, get one contractor in, do the whole street, do it all together, share the process, share the costs. That's an ideal world. Practically, it's not really going to happen. And practically, not everyone can afford to do a whole house retrofit in one go. And unfortunately, schemes like Green Deal don't seem to have cracked that particular nut. So I think phased retrofit is inevitable. And it's okay, as long as you take the time and care to do the right things at the right time, find the right trigger points, and don't make mistakes in terms of doing things that mean you can't then continue your retrofit later. Don't make the building super airtight without thinking about ventilation.
There's no danger that if you did one phase, I'm going to use a really bad expression here, that it might go off by the time you got to the next stage?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess it depends how long between stages, but the sort of things that we're advocating, insulation and triple glazed windows, they're going to last 60 years, or longer, if looked after. So they're not going to go off in the timescale. A boiler, if you replaced a boiler at the beginning as your first measure, maybe in 15 years that's reached the end of its design life, especially if you haven't retrofitted some of the rest of the property and you've been thrashing it to the max for all those times. Yeah, then you may have to look at those replacement bits. It's usually the moving bits are the ones that you're going to have to deal with. But that's the beauty of retrofit, energy efficient retrofits, is that we're talking about things that should last the life of the building, insulation standards, new windows, those sorts of measures.
Do you see any one factor or a couple of factors preventing most people from going out there and retrofitting, or do they really not even know about it? They might downsize before they retrofit.
Knowledge, it's a bit of a minefield. I've been working in it for several years, and I don't pretend to have all the answers to every scenario. So we're still learning. If you take something like suspended timber floors, there's a whole area of research there that's still ongoing, and people don't even now really know exactly the optimum thing to do in every scenario. So knowledge is a bit of a problem. There are some good resources out there now, though. Even outside the profession, as ordinary people, you can go to your library and get a Haynes manual on doing eco homes or how to insulate your house. So there's a lot more resource out there for people. I think the whole issue about how we value our properties needs to change. And until we manage to change that perception in the marketplace, then cost is always going to be a barrier for some people. And doing it, we need to kind of do this collectively as a nation. We've got this big problem, we've got this big opportunity. Let's not forget that retrofitting our country is going to create a lot of jobs. It's going to create a lot of income for government, actually, through VAT, through diverting money from benefits, etc., from diverting money from the NHS. It's a complete win-win situation if only we could get our heads around that and fund it properly.
Is there anything else, either around retrofitting or phased retrofitting, that you think is worth adding right at the very end here?
Yeah, I think we need to have an overview of our building stock in this country. We have some great older buildings that really, are the cultural heritage of our nation. And we also have a lot of post-war stock that's perhaps not so loved. The heritage stock we want to hold on to. We don't want to retrofit it to the extent that it damages those properties. But equally, we do want to be able to improve the comfort for people that are living in that stock. But there's a limit to how far we can go in those properties. Post-war housing stock, on the other hand, I really think we should be looking at every opportunity to go to the very best standard on that, to NFIT standard or Passive House standard, to compensate for all those heritage properties. But as individual organisations, building owners or social landlords or local authorities, nobody's making that bigger picture decision. We're only making individual decisions about that, and it's only really a government that can have that overview, and that's what I think is lacking at the moment. Somebody to take that overall view of our housing stock and our non-domestic stock as well, and say, this is the target that we need to get to here, this is the target that we can accept here. That's what's lacking.
Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mirastagy, as we say in Cornwall.
Well, hopefully that is a good end to the interview. I have no idea what it means, or perhaps it's even another reference to a Cornish pasty. That would be good, wouldn't it? Mark had some interesting points, didn't he? And I do wonder about whole street retrofits, and that there must be some way of making it happen for those streets, particularly that are ripe for it. Mark was saying that he walks around and thinks, oh, this area or this building might be good. Another question that I was really happy to ask Mark about was the bolt hole idea, because in my mind, it worked perfectly. So it was good to be struck down there a bit and to hear that actually, no, perhaps it's not as practical as I might have thought. But you can find out more about Mark and Sustainable by Design, houseplanninghelp.com/39. There's a question in the show notes too. I would like to know whether a phased retrofit is an option that you would consider. I don't know of too many examples, so maybe you're someone who's gone ahead with this, you've done phase one already. I would love to hear from you, or perhaps you just look at it and think, this is not a good idea, or I'm going to downsize first, or build new. I would love your comments on this one in the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/39. It's a new year, and we often make New Year's resolutions or set goals. It's pretty silly because you should do this at any time of the year whenever you feel ready to do it. But one of mine that I would really like to achieve this year is to get my first investment property. Thinking long term, I'd love it to be energy efficient housing stock only. I don't know that this exists at the moment. I'm trying to find out more about it, but that would be great to have those properties, and almost that, I suppose, could be an excuse to do them up along the way. But I've been listening to this great podcast. It's UK specific, although saying that, there's a lot of information that I think would apply wherever you are buying property to rent out and to use as an investment. But I wanted to recommend it to you, and it's Rob and Rob. Two Robs are the host of the Property Podcast. So go and check it out. I've put a link in the show notes, and I've found some of the information has been really, really helpful. So I wanted to make this as a recommendation for you, perhaps if you're thinking of going down this line. If not, well, don't worry about it. My call to action this week is that you could leave us a review on iTunes. It's very simple to do, and it improves the chances of us being found by others, and hopefully them getting some value from this podcast too. So that would be absolutely fantastic. And let's look ahead to next time. Martin Holliday from Green Building Advisor is my guest. Amongst other things, we'll discuss whether Passive House is really a world standard. Until then, take care.